Spengler publishes Volume 1 of Decline of the West in 1918, just as the Germans had lost World War I. Now, Spengler was a high school teacher, and he was one of these fellows who didn't care for academics any more than I do, and he just sort of floated around on the peripheries of German culture. 10 years working as a high school teacher, and then he was gradually nurturing this idea, and it gradually sort of took shape in his mind, and he decided to quit and go write this book. And he, like Nietzsche, had trouble with migraine headaches, so he was able to get a disability from the state, and he never married. He was a bachelor, and he had a sister who, in a sense, became a kind of, I guess, a surrogate wife for him after her marriage didn't work out. In later years, she moved in with him. He lived up into his 50s and died of a heart attack. He didn't have a very happy life. He was not a happy person at all. And what we know about his childhood was that he was tormented by nightmares and had a very difficult time growing up. We don't know a lot about his background. We just do know that he was this sort of isolated genius. And so he sort of then decides to write this book, and he's up late at night. He's staying up till like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning just reading everything he can get his hands on to bolster this thesis about the decline of civilization. And he says, if you look at the first page of The Decline of the West, he says, my two greatest thinkers are Goethe and Nietzsche. Nietzsche was the first, really, to begin to see how civilization falls apart. He was the first to begin to see the way in which his first book is The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's, which he publishes in 1872. And the thesis in that book was that Greek tragedy fell apart the moment that it sort of lost this wonderful balance between the Apollonian tension and the Dionysian tension. And the Apollonian, Apollo, is the god of restraint and the sun and light and reason and structure and clarity. Dionysus, on the other hand, is the god of wine, of madness, of drunken intoxication, of sexuality, the moons. So we have two radically opposed gods. But the way in which those tendencies work into Greek tragedy are such that the chorus represents the Dionysiac element, because the Greek chorus is the collective unconscious of the Greek people. And they're always the ones standing off to the side of the stage saying, we know what's going to happen. Here's what the hero has done wrong, blah, blah, blah. The hero himself represents the Apollonian element because he is the individual person who has been differentiated from the mass, and anything Dionysian is collective, anything Apollonian is individualized. So that and Greek tragedy emerged as this figure kept stepping. Originally, these were just rituals, and these men would sort of wear these goat skins, hence tragos from the word goat, and they would do these sort of evocations of the life of the death of Dionysus. And the way in which the tragedy sort of spun itself into being was that this individual would step out from the chorus and begin to take on a role that gradually began to differentiate itself from the rest of the chorus, and the role would be, say, the individual would incarnate Dionysus or some other suffering god. And they would go through the whole process of him sort of being torn apart and put back together again. And then gradually this began to shape itself. A couple of geniuses came in, and they started differentiating a second person. So once you got those two persons, and you got a dialogue going between them, now you've got the basis for drama. So you have this dialogue back and forth between two individuals and the chorus. That's the Apollonian over here, the Dionysian over here. And normally, Greek tragedy is based on the sufferings of one or another individual who comes to his misfortune as a result of an error in judgment. Agamemnon, comes home from the Trojan War in Aeschylus's play, and Clytemnestra's there, and she makes a bath for him, and everything's all nice and warm, returning home to mother. And while he's in the bathtub, she pulls out a sword and plunges it into him, and that's it for him. And the way in which this is set up, though, is that Agamemnon sort of comes back from the war, and Aeschylus has him saying, well, I sure did great over there, and he's taking all this credit to his own ego instead of making references to the gods who helped him win the war. So that ego inflation is seen as part of the justification for his death. But the real reason, of course, why Clytemnestra has murdered him is because in the beginning, when the Trojan War was starting, none of the ships would sail. None of the gods would allow the ships to sail unless somebody made a sacrifice. Well, Helen is the sister of Clytemnestra, and she's been abducted They've got to go get her back. Well, Agamemnon steps forward and he says, I'll sacrifice my daughter. So he takes Iphigenia, takes her out, offers her to the gods. She's a sacrifice, and off the winds go. Well, Clytemnestra killed him for that reason, for sacrificing their daughter. Now, it turns out later there are variations where Iphigenia never did die and was left on the island, and we find out that she survived, and all these other variations of it. Yeah, very much so. But the point is that the beauty of Greek tragedy, at the moment when it was great, and Nietzsche says it was great with Aeschylus and Sophocles. And Aeschylus was the brilliant one, I believe, who introduced the second character so that you could have a dialogue between two individuals. And you never have in these classical tragedies more than two people on the stage at any one time. That's the sort of unwritten rule, other than the chorus. And so this beautiful lyrical balance between the chorus and the two other individuals on the stage, and the sufferings of the individual, and the chorus representing the will, the sort of collective will of the Greek people, began to be lost after you go through Sophocles, and Sophocles has this Oedipus Rex drama, and then Euripides comes on stage, and the problem is Euripides brings in too much intellect. He steps onto the stage, and he begins rationalizing things. He's the first to sort of introduce the common man. He sort of brings in these common individuals, and instead of having this exalted, elevated characters who are walking archetypes, they become these sort of common men. And so the gods are portrayed, and the heroes are portrayed as though they were just, whoever from the back alleys. And not only that, but then he has the chorus gradually begins to be pushed out, so that the monologue begins to be taken over, and the monologue develops as a result of this doing away with the chorus and having the lead characters talk through these things out loud. So Nietzsche says that was when Greek tragedy began to fall apart, when the intellect came in. And lost in this perfect balance between Apollo and Dionysus was lost in favor of Apollo. But then Nietzsche says this was happening in Greek culture as a whole during this period, because this is the period of Socrates. And as Euripides was writing his tragedies, Socrates was going around questioning everyone about everything, which is good. I mean, this is the birth of the intellectual soul after all. But the problem with that is Socrates is turning everything into a problem. Everything has to be verbalized and analyzed to death. And for Nietzsche, there's a turning point in every culture where the intellect takes over. And once the intellect takes over and begins to sterilize spirituality and the gods out of existence, the culture begins to fall apart, because it begins to lose contact with its myths. Plato writes all these things down. Plato started out wanting to be a dramatist, but you see, drama was dying out as a viable art form, and there just wasn't any creative energy, any potential within it for Plato to do anything with it. So he ends up inventing the dialogue, where you have these, characters. Socrates is the lead character always in the dialogues of Plato, analyzing everything to death, but you have this vestigial relic of the dramatic form in the dialogue itself. And so Nietzsche says the Platonic dialogue was the life raft that Greek tragedy sort of clung onto as it was going down. And so then he sort of paints this picture of Greek civilization falling apart and the coming on stage of the Socratic man, and then Spengler picks this idea up from him and says, what if this can be generalized into a universal rule? What if we look at all these great high civilizations, can we find a turning point in every one of them where the Socratic man comes on stage and begins to question everything, and the culture begins to fall apart? And Spengler's response was, yes, indeed. Every one of these cultures, all the great high civilizations, fall apart when they shift over to a period of rationalism. It happens in our case when Rousseau comes in. Rousseau and Voltaire, there we are back again with the French, questioning everything, analyzing everything. Sort of Voltaire making fun of religion, and Rousseau sort of bringing in this kind of rationality and a kind of romanticism, but just sort of questioning everything. So our culture then begins to fall apart, according to Nietzsche and Spengler, right about in the 18th century, analogous to what took place with the Greeks in the time of Socrates. And then Spengler generalizes this, and he looks at Hindu civilization, and he says, well, the Buddha represented this aspect, the Socratic man appearing on stage in Hindu civilization. Here we have an individual appearing on stage who will have nothing to do with the gods, and original Hinayana Buddhism just has nothing to do with the gods whatsoever. It's a strictly nihilistic religion. Buddha steps on stage, and the only thing that is important is nirvana. Everything else is done away with. So original Buddhism is entirely nihilistic. And at the same time that Buddha was propounding these ideas, there was a philosophical movement known as the Sankhya system. And the Sankhya system was one of the first Hindu systems that began to spin out theories about the origins of matter, the three gunas, the Purusha, which is the soul, and its involvement in Prakriti, matter, without any reference to deities whatsoever. So India indeed did begin to enter into a period of rationalism, and but Spengler's thesis almost doesn't work here because the Hindus sort of made a recovery, and the period he says they should be falling apart, they're really going through a restructuring, and they sort of get it back together again for a while. But so that's sort of Spengler's starting point, is that all civilizations go through a cycle of rise and fall. And then he says there are 9 civilizations that have done this. And he eschews any sort of model of the great chain of being. He doesn't want any kind of evolution of consciousness here, except within the particular culture in question, going through this life cycle of beginning with inspired religiosity, moving into a lyrical, poetic phase, then into a kind of prosaic philosophical phase, and then into a disintegration. That cultural life cycle is the only thing that has to do with the kind of evolution of consciousness that he will admit to in history. But what he does is he says, my thesis represents a Copernican vision of history, as opposed to a Ptolemaic one. Now, what's a Ptolemaic vision of history? Well, a Ptolemaic vision of history is what you always get when you sit down in a classroom and they say, open your textbooks to the Greeks, and we'll start there. With this ridiculous ancient medieval modern scheme where everything ends up with the moderns, and we as moderns are the center of the universe, and everything has led up to this point, and we're just the greatest thing on earth. Well, Spengler says, no, if each one of these civilizations has gone through the morphology of its life cycle, then what we're going through now is a life cycle embedded within Northern European civilization that is analogous to all of these others. Each one of these 9 cultures can be regarded as its own center, within which each one of these civilizations develops its own mathematics, its own arts, its own sciences. There is no history of art. There is no history of science. There is no history of truth. There are simply truths that make sense only when you look at them in the context of the civilization out of which it emerged. So looking at these 9 civilizations then, we can sort of start with the Babylonian, although Spengler doesn't say much about them because the Sumerian information had not come in yet, and the Babylonians are to the Sumerians what the Romans are to the Greeks and what we are to the Europeans. So we have the Babylonian civilization, which dates from 3500 BC. And he says each one of these civilizations lasts for about 1,000 years. So it takes about 1,000 years for a civilization to go through this life cycle. And if you look at the cultures which are around today in terms of the high civilizations, if you look and you say the Muslim world is still around, it's much older than that, the Hindus are here, the Chinese are here, well, in a certain sense, they've passed their moment of creative lyricism. These are sort of gigantic petrified logs in a gigantic forest. What they're picking up from is the vitality of the West beginning to enter into its dying phase. And that's sort of revitalizing them momentarily. But otherwise, they're these sort of gigantic petrified logs within this forest. And so we have the Babylonian civilization going through, 3,500 to about 2,500 BC. And each one of these civilizations has its own informing idea. And this is the crucial thing about Spengler. This central Platonic idea that is the organizing archetype for every aspect of that civilization. It's trying to exteriorize that idea as though it were the soul of the culture. Spengler got this from Goethe's model of plant growth, because Goethe had said every aspect of any plant, if you look, whether you're looking at the roots, or whether you're looking at the corolla, whether you're looking at the sex organs of the plant, what you're looking at is a modified leaf. In every case, the leaf is the archetype out of which all plants are transformed in every single aspect of the plant. Open an orange and you'll see modified leaves in there that have been sectioned off. That was Goethe's idea. And so Spengler sort of picks up that idea. Instead of leaf as the central organizing idea, each culture has its own central organizing idea that is the metaphysical soul of that civilization. And once that civilization has exhausted everything that it wants to do in terms of getting it out, of articulating that idea, it exhausts itself and begins to die, sink into the earth, and return back to the mother, just like a plant. So these civilizations are analogous to these sort of gigantic plants that grow up out of the earth, flower, and then die again. So it's a very organic model. And the sort of primary idea for the Babylonian culture is line and angle in space. There's a kind of rectilinear emphasis in Babylonian art when you look at it. Everything is very angular. The Babylonians took over the ziggurat from the Sumerians, and the original Sumerian ziggurat was in the shape of a cow vagina, which is this gigantic round thing. And the Babylonians took over that idea from them, and they have this very sharp, right-angled, rectilinear civilization that they built out of that. Then we go from the Babylonian to the Egyptian. And the Egyptian culture, the dates are about 3000 BC for its creative period to about 2000 BC. Well, actually further down than that, but it begins to fall apart right about 2000 BC. And the central organizing idea of Egyptian civilization is this idea of what he calls the way. And by the way, what he means is, when you look at every aspect of Egyptian culture, it's organized along the single narrow path leading toward the Day of Judgment. And every Egyptian had this in mind as a central anxiety of his existence. That Day of Judgment was coming. And if you're looking at the sort of avenue of the Sphinxes, you know, in order to get into any of these temples, you have to walk down this long corridor. You can't go to the right, you can't go to the left. Destiny is pushing you, and you are gliding along its surface toward the throne of Osiris, the day where you will be judged. There was no apocalypse in Egyptian civilization, but they had this miniature apocalypse for each individual, had to face the scales within which the heart was weighed against a feather of the goddess Mot. And that feather represented truth, and the heart represented the soul. The heart was the only organ that the Egyptians left in the body, because you're going to need that to weigh it on the scale. And if the heart is heavier than the feather, you have not lived a life in accordance with truth. In other words, you have not lived a spiritual life. And there's a little monster, a crocodile monster over here, waiting to gobble it up. Right. And you're out of luck. And if, however, the feather is heavier than the heart, then the initiate will be ushered over to the throne of Osiris, who sits as Lord of the Dead, and you'll be granted your immortality or reincarnation as Osiris sees fit. This idea, by the way, of the scales and the monster was taken over by the Christians as the Archangel Michael, who always carries a pair of scales. And on the scales you find the damned are always tilting down this way, and the saved are always up here, and the devil's trying to tilt the scales down toward this gigantic mouth with these razor-sharp teeth, which personifies hell, waiting to swallow up the damned. But the Christians took this straight out of the Egyptian mythology. So that's the central organizing idea of Egyptian civilization, this gliding surface. Everything is built out of these gliding surfaces over which the individual can find no purchase and must slide into the jaws of this beast, or the Day of Judgment. So then he says, what's the central organizing idea of, let's see, we have the Babylonian and the Egyptian, and then we have, the Greco-Roman, well, let's first finish with the Hindus and the Chinese briefly. He doesn't say much about these peripheral civilizations that I'm talking about, just sort of comments that he drops. The Hindu is this idea of the world as dream. If you look on the statues of all of Indian art, the eyes are always closed of whoever's represented, whatever god, whatever yogi, the eyes are closed. For the Hindus, the world is a dream, and they've gone down inward to find the source of that dream. And the entire world is Maya. It's an illusion in that sense, the outer world is. And they've sort of gone down inward to find that. Spengler doesn't say much about the Hindu culture other than that morphology that we talked about. And for the Chinese, it is this idea of the Tao, which, in contrast to the Egyptian, which is just straight, it's it wanders. The Tao is this thing that's just the wandering path of nature, and the individual will be carried along this path if he or she is in touch with the Tao. There's a story about a Chinese emperor who tried to stop a flood by building dams, and that only made the flood worse. So the next emperor had success because he was in touch with the Tao by building canals to channel the water. So he was in touch with the Tao. So the Chinese idea is not resisting nature, but going with it, finding the Tao, which way it's going to fall, and go the way that nature is going to go, and you'll just be carried right along by it. So that's the sort of primary idea of the Chinese culture and the Indian culture. Now he recognizes the Mexican-American civilization, but he doesn't give a symbol for it because there again, not much was known at that time about that civilization. He just recognizes it and gives a little footnote about it going through this morphology. So that gives us those, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the Russian civilization, he says, is the only civilization that is yet unborn out of this group. The Russian civilization, the primary organizing symbol, you can already see it emerging, is this horizontal plane. A vast, horizontal, endless plane. If you look at the way the Kremlin is organized, it's this gigantic rectangular thing. If you look at the streets in Moscow, there are these huge, open, flat spaces. If you look at the Russian Orthodox churches, the spires are these so-called onion-shaped spires, in contrast to our Gothic spires, which just go straight up. Now, the Russian word for heaven is nebo, which in its end indicates something negative. The Russian, Spengler says, the idea of a Russian being an astronomer is ridiculous. And this may be the reason why the Russians never made it to the moon. For them, the heavens is something that really doesn't exist. They just see this horizontal plane stretching to infinity. They're looking down at the earth. That is really what they want. And when you look at the narrative, say, of Dostoevsky, there's this idea that Dostoevsky, in Crime and Punishment, for example, Raskolnikov has committed this crime against the Russian Brotherhood and must be brought down onto the plane with this sort of fraternal piety of this Russian Brotherhood. So that was the sort of idea that the Russian sense sounded like something that would be politically good for communism. Because there is this sort of collectivist brotherhood emphasis in the Russian culture, because that's consistent with this sort of horizontal idea, rather than the filial piety, which would represent his sort of vertical tendency to worship the father. They just don't have that. So he doesn't say much about the Russian culture either, other than those comments, and that it represents the future at some point. Then, the central discussion of the book is based on the contrast between the Greco-Roman civilization, which he calls Apollonian, and our civilization, the Northern European, which he calls Faustian. And he says the reason why we're so fascinated with the Greco-Roman civilization is because we are the two most opposite cultures. The biggest tension exists between these two cultures. There's one sandwich in between here that he calls the Magian culture, which is composed of the Judeo-Christian Islamic culture group, as well as the Byzantine and the Persian group. He clusters those in between, so that the dates he gives here are 1000 BC to 0, 0 to 1000 AD, 1000 AD to 2000. Now, this 1,000-year thing doesn't work very well when you look at the cultures of the Far East, India and China, because their creative period, if you want to be fair about it, really extends from 1500 BC to 1500 AD. They've got about a 3,000-year creative arc before they're wiped out. In the case of India, the Muslims come in, but they're already decaying anyway. Well, we won't get into that. So we have the Greco-Roman culture, and their primary symbol is the body. The primary symbol of Faustian culture is infinite space. And then the primary symbol for the Magians is the world as cavern. So now this thing about the Greeks is, with respect to the body, every aspect of Greek culture is based on a kind of extension or obsession with the physical body. The Greeks were absolutely terrified of anything that suggested an infinity, infinite horizons, or anything far or distant. They really liked staying close to the body. there's this kind of emphasis on the opposition between form and matter. According to Aristotle, the soul is the form of the body. Sounds like a somewhat strange statement to us. And the polis, city-state, which is the primary political organization of the Greco-Roman culture. The city-state as polis is something that's visible. If you stand up on a hill, the highest point in the city, you can see the entire city. It's kept very carefully within visibility. The nation-state, on the other hand, is something that, as you know, is far too large to see from any one perspective point. And the cavern, the political organization in the Magian culture, is what he calls the consensus. This consensus is not necessarily geographically bound. The way the Greco-Romans were very careful to have their idea politically bound to a specific geography. The nation-state is also bound to geography, although a very large geography, but the consensus is not. The societies within the Magian civilization, whether you're talking about the Jewish group or the Zoroastrians, are all held together by common belief. There must be a consensus. And moreover, there's a sort of possession of a sacred text, and that consensus is a reflection of that sacred text, because the idea is that truth descends down from the Spirit, descends down and inhabits all of us, and when someone utters something that is true that everyone agrees on, they agree on it because it's rooted in the Spirit, and the Spirit can never lie. So truth doesn't come from the individual ego within these cultures. It comes from God. It is truth in that sense. So consistent with this, each culture has a different idea of the way in which destiny works. In the Greek system, destiny is called moira, and true to the physical, bodily nature of the Greco-Roman culture, moira actually has reference to a spatial boundary, such that when one god oversteps one boundary, moira is something that the god is subject to. And moira is sort of this thing that's immanent in the cosmos, and even the gods are subject to it. The gods, as well as the heroes, are equally subject to moira, to this necessity that pays back injustices with injustices. And then we have the central destiny idea in the Magian culture is kismet. It's the Arabic version of it, which is that destiny comes from God. That's the single sole source. Here the gods are subordinate to an immanent destiny. And in the Faustian culture, the individual destiny is this word called weird. In Shakespeare, it's spelled W-E-I-R-D. The Weird Sisters in Macbeth are a late echo of. But it's first articulated in Beowulf, when Beowulf goes out to meet his weird, his destiny, where he goes out to do battle with the dragon, which kills him, and he also kills the dragon. They sort of mutually wipe each other out. But here the idea is destiny unfolds from within the individual, so that you can see that the Jungian theory of destiny unfolding from within the self is rooted in this. In fact, the original word for the individuation process was Menschwerdung, and Verdung, or Werden rather, is the German word for to become, and it's derived from this weird, Werden, Menschwerdung, the becoming of an individual. So Jung is coming out of this Faustian destiny idea, that destiny unfolds from within, and the sort of primary characters, you have Oedipus over here, personifying this fate that is inflicted upon him. And then Job is sort of primary character here, who also has to submit to a fate that comes directly from God. And then the characters of the Faustian culture, you can sort of begin with Parzival as the Grail quester, Faust, Hamlet. They're all characters. Spengler says that the characters of Northern European literature are the loneliest characters in the history of literature. Whether we're thinking of Hamlet brooding about his fate, or Wotan and Wagner's Ring Cycle brooding about this cosmic cycle that he can do nothing to stop, or whether we think of Parzival's lonely journeys through these dark, gloomy Nordic forests in quest of the Grail, or Faust's lonely quest for the infinite moment, or Ahab's quest to kill the whale. These are lonely individuals, but they're consistent with this Faustian destiny idea. I mean, this actually continues right on into our cinema. You have the sort of Godfather films with Michael Corleone working out his destiny. And now in terms of the Well, in terms of the mathematics, each culture develops its own mathematics here. Euclidean geometry is a geometry of magnitudes, static magnitudes, very sensuous, very much a geometry of physicality. Magian is the algebra where you have these mysterious x's and y's, these magical substance properties. In many ways, the Magian culture, as we'll see with Gebser tomorrow, and its retrieval of the cavern world, is a kind of regression to this earlier magical structure of consciousness, in which you have these mysterious substances at work in the world, and the algebra is a reflection of this. Their primary science, for example, is alchemy. The Arabs really brought that to perfection. And over here we have statics. And the primary mathematic in the Faustian is the infinitesimal calculus. A feeling for no Greek could ever, no matter how they twisted and turned the way that they thought, could ever have come up with a calculus. Because the soul of the Greek civilization was such that infinity was terrifying to them. This is why the Copernican hypothesis, this is the real reason why, when Aristarchus first proposed this heliocentric hypothesis, it was discarded. It was inconsistent with what the soul of Greek civilization wanted. A closed, bounded universe. Something very sensuous, a sort of gigantic sculpture. And the primary art form for the Greeks is sculpture. They brought it to a perfection that no one else really ever has. And the primary art form for the Magian is this arabesque style that the Arabs brought to consummate perfection, these geometrical patterns. And the primary art form is classical music for our civilization. Classical music is something quite unique because it's based on polyphony, and polyphony gives you a sense of the infinite through sound. You have this sort of, one chorus begins the line here, and the next group starts the same line halfway through, and you go down, and you get this sense of polyphony. Originally, the church didn't like polyphony because you couldn't hear the words of the Mass, because they overlap with each other as they go through this polyphonic. But what that is the equivalent within music of the discovery of depth perspective in painting. And that depth perspective is the sense of the Faustian quest out into infinite space, breaking out of this closed-in cavern and going out into infinite space. From the Gothic cathedrals to the rockets that we sent to the moon, there is a consistency of world feeling here in Northern European and American civilization, this quest for infinite space. The sort of movement from the Romanesque arches and the Romanesque cathedrals to the Gothic arches, which suddenly bring in this vertical upthrust. You remember the cupola of the Russian Orthodox churches are onion-shaped. They deny that upthrust. From that is the breaking open of this Magian cavern, just blowing off the sort of ceiling of the universe and stepping out into infinite space. We have been obsessed with this infinite space and this idea of a lonely ego out here in the center of infinite space radiating off in all directions is the sort of primary idea that has motivated Northern European civilization. Even the articulation of the first law of physics, that an object will remain in motion forever unless it's stopped by an external force, is the same idea. For the Greeks, an object would remain in motion only so long as it was in contact with something pushing it. You imagine a shopping cart, the Greek would say, the shopping cart will go until I stop pushing it, and then it just rolls to a stop. Well, the Faustian will come in and say, well, what if you just sort of grease the road and you eliminate friction, give the shopping cart a push, and it'll go a hell of a lot further, won't it? What if we eliminate all the friction, it'll just sail off to infinity? And that starts, with Buridan's impetus theory, the idea that you don't need angels turning the spheres when you have this idea of God kicking the spheres in a frictionless space that sets them in motion forever. So this idea, this has been our primary obsession, this fascination with infinity that has given birth to everything that has poured itself forth out of Faustian civilization. And it's exactly opposite to this Greco-Roman idea of the world as a beautiful little work of art. This classical temple where everything is elegant and quaint and closed in, this sort of a Parthenon with the pediment here, everything is thrusting down, very self-enclosed, this weight of the architrave. It's exactly the opposite to the cathedral that breaks open space. I mean, the whole idea of the discovery of the birth of the Gothic cathedral in the 12th century was based on this idea of, well, you know what, we could sort of expand this thing to sort of encompass infinite space just by bringing in a flying buttress that'll hold the walls, and we can shoot the walls up and eliminate the walls with these huge stained glass paintings. And you're sort of blowing out the cosmos, this closed-in, dark, dank, Romanesque cavern world. That is that thrust, that passionate desire for infinite space. And the Magian, meanwhile, still to this day, in a certain sense, remains closed in within the cavern world of the horizon. You know, out in these deserts, the world is a gigantic dome. And Spengler comes up with this idea that's rather unique, which he calls pseudomorphosis. And he says the early phase of the Magian culture, which begins to originate just as the Roman Empire is forming, and the Greco-Roman culture is collapsing and dying into this uninspired, very heavy, very unlyrical Roman militaristic civilization where there are no real competent artists, but there are great military tacticians, just as we have in America to a large extent. He says the first cavern really is the Pantheon, and the Pantheon isn't an Arabic building, it isn't associated with any of these religions, but it's something new, entirely unprecedented. The Greek would never have thought of this inner dome world, because this is essentially, the Pantheon is, with these columns, is essentially a building that's entirely outdoors. There really is no interior to these buildings. It's a sort of colonnade that you walk around. Whereas with respect to the domical world, and pseudomorphosis, by the way, means false formation, and Spengler has just taken it from mineralogy to mean you get a mineral. If you break open the mineral, there's a mineral inside it that's incongruous with the outer mineral. It's not the same mineral on the inside. So the soul of Magian culture was the weight of the Greco-Roman culture lay so heavily over the Near East, which is generally its locus, that this culture could not get its own life going, and had to first express itself through these these dying Greco-Roman culture forms. And when it finally did explode, this kind of accounts for the passionate zeal of the Arabic world, which just, you know, expands out and goes over North Africa and tries to worm its way up into Spain. Same thing happened to us, however, vis-a-vis the cavern, because the cavern, the cathedral, really is a closed-in, it's still a cavern, whether it's Gothic or Romanesque. And as we'll see with Gebser, it took us a while to break out of that closed universe that we inherited from the Magians, and we have sort of dual pseudomorphosis, a very heavy Greco-Roman influence, and a very heavy Near Eastern Jewish influence. And between these two parent cultures, it took us a while to find our own expression forms. This is why Joseph Campbell comes in and he says, having read Spengler, he comes in and he says, the Abrahamic religions have nothing to do with our civilization. They're based on a totally different structure of thinking, a consensus mentality versus the individual mentality. In our civilization, we question authority. You know, we have this tradition of questioning authority that you don't have in the Magian culture. And bringing Christianity over into Northern Europe was the imposition of a false form onto Europe, just as Russia now is suffering from a pseudomorphosis by the way of the imposition of European culture forms. They're having trouble finding their own expression language, but they'll break out of it sooner or later. But you know, St. Peter the Great coming in and coming to Europe and copying all the architecture in Europe, and then going back to Petersburg and building this city that's based on a copy of European architecture. And then you get Dostoevsky centuries later saying, you know, St. Petersburg feels like a ghost town to me. It doesn't feel authentic. And so the Russians are still struggling to break out of their pseudomorphosis. And it takes a while, but once it happens, it's quite dynamic. And so this sort of, in a scaled-down model, is Spengler's vision of these closed-in cultures. And the final point that I want to make is with respect to the morphology of these cultures in terms of the sort of 1,000-year arc that I talked about. There are these distinct stages within that each one of these cultures goes through. There's a pre-culture stage. There's early culture stage. A late culture stage. and then the final decadent period is civilization. There's a distinction in German that doesn't exist in English between culture with a K and civilization, where culture refers to a civilization inspired by art, and civilization refers to an inorganic civilization that's just based on organization. Megalopolitan, gigantic, overpopulated, but uninspired for the most part. And these correspond to, spring, summer, autumn, and winter of the cycle of the culture in question. So it's very organic morphology that unfolds over these, it's about 250 years apiece for those to make up for the 1,000-year arc. Although the civilization phase, once attained, can last for a very long time. The Romans ended up short. They could have gone for a while with that imperial organization. That can last for a long time. Once you get into that phase, the creativity slowly dies down, as it did when you look at Roman history. They just sort of stop thinking about things, and they just sort of they cease becoming interested in innovation and start copying. They can't build works of art anymore, so they start hodgepodge putting things together. The creative life is just, vitality is just dying out of the culture. If you look at the Faustian civilization, just as a quick demonstration, and we say the pre-culture period of the Faustian civilization begins about the year 1000 AD. Spengler says it usually begins with lots of apocalyptic imagery. And the sign of apocalyptic imagery is the sign that a new civilization is coming into being, because it's the sudden intuition of this fascination with death that marks the birth of a new culture. And the same might be said for our culture, which is fascinated with apocalypticism right now. Something new is coming out of this, possibly, which we'll see what Gebser says about that tomorrow. So right about the year 1000 AD, you get the Romanesque cathedral comes in as the culture form. You get these anonymous epics. The Beowulf story is written down, and you get the Song of Roland, and you get the Nibelungenlied. They're all these sort of collective epics written by anonymous people. We don't know who put them together, and they represent the folk soul of the Song of Roland is the primary epic of France during this period. And then that period concludes with the Grail romances, where now you start to get specific writers coming in and articulating the mythology of Europe as the individual quest for fulfillment. And that represents the sort of transition into the early culture period, and the transition from the Romanesque architecture to the Gothic architecture, which happens at the same time as the Grail quests are being written out. Grail literature dates from 1180 to 1210. The discovery of the Gothic cathedral is about 1150. Both signify this transition into the early culture period. And then polyphony is first, you get Gregorian chant first in music, and then polyphony comes in at about the same time and signifies the shift. So you have polyphony, and you have the Grail romances and the Gothic architecture all coming into being about the same time. Then you get the early culture period, and you get these sort of, in the literature sphere, you get these individualized epics by the Italians, Tasso and Ariosto, and they're sort of picking up these faint echoes of medieval literature. But then you get the novel. It starts to come in with Don Quixote, and then you have Shakespeare's plays coming in. And then the transition in terms of the architecture is from the cathedral now to the princely palaces of the Baroque. You start moving into this late culture period in between the sort of summer and autumn. The primary architectural fascination becomes these wonderful princely palaces from the Baroque period. And you move from this sort of early theocratic phase to an aristocratic phase, and then the middle classes begin coming in here. Then you sort of, the late culture winds up with the Socratic man coming in on stage. The intellect comes in, begins to sterilize everything out of existence. You get the Age of Reason, with Voltaire and Rousseau and this French Enlightenment period, and the culture begins to sort of stiffen a bit. And then the sort of final climax of the culture period comes in with the novel coming into full maturity at the end of the 18th century, Tom Jones and Clarissa and Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and all of that. And then that begins to wind down. And then, of course, right about this time, if you wind back one century, you get the birth of classical music in its grand style toward the end of the 17th century. You get Bach coming in, and then you have the transition into the 18th century where classical music becomes the primary art form of the 18th century. Painting has done about what it's going to do with the perspectival style and fades into the background for a while. Classical music steps on stage, and all the great masters come in. Mozart, Haydn, Gluck, Steinmetz. All these individuals come in, and then the transition to the late winter phase begins to happen with Beethoven, where the classical, he begins to sort of analyze these forms out of existence. The creative output between Mozart is gigantic, and compared to the number of things that Beethoven wrote, is very small compared. So you had, once you start getting into that struggle where creativity becomes more and more difficult, you know something's dying out in the culture. Spengler says, by the way, populations, when they get into this very late winter stage, begin to die out. And they sort of, once you enter into this kind of megalopolitan civilization phase, and people start debating about whether they should or should not have children, you passed the spontaneity point of the culture. It's beginning to die out. You're beginning to question whether life should even come into being at all. And the fact that it would even occur to you as a question and should not be spontaneous and self-evident, it signifies the beginning of the end. Culture is beginning to slowly exterminate itself from within. As the Greco-Roman culture did, and you get all these problems, what do we do about the problem of birth? Do we abort the baby, or do we bring it into being? All that happened in the Roman civilization. There were birth problems. Then the birth rates declined, and gradually in the Roman Empire you get these populations just vanishing, and you get these cities out in the deserts slowly turning into these ghost towns as the soul of the civilization begins to contract and implode in on itself. That's what happens. The arts die out. They shift over into these megalopolitan arts in the civilization phase of the masses. The city, before the underpopulation, there's this overpopulation phase when the cities are gigantic and megalopolitan. And so Spengler says we have been since the 19th century about where the Greek and Roman civilization was as they were approaching the year zero, and the Roman Republic was beginning to die out and shift over into the Imperium. And at the same time, you get this reversion back to bloody politics. The Roman Republic begins to break down, and if you want to get into the office, you got to kill someone to get in. That's the sort of reversion back to the early tribal barbarism that the culture began in. And once that starts to happen, that's coming to an end too. And indeed, if it turns out that the government did assassinate JFK, that will be the beginnings of the enunciation of our slow reversion into these brutal politics of force, whereby the representative idea just simply breaks down. In the Roman case, the Roman civilization had begun with a sequence of 7 kings, and they got rid of the idea of kingship because they couldn't stand this idea of a monarchy. So they got rid of the kings and put in 2 sort of primary leaders who would check each other. So they developed a whole system of checks and balances. And we, as Americans, modeled our system of government on that check and balance system of the Romans. But the problem with that system is that the checks and balances over time begin to interfere with each other, such that you get a gradual gridlock that forms, and nobody can decide on anything. And the only way to bust that open is with bringing in force, violence. This is what happened in the Roman civilization. But along with this reversion to barbarism, what you also get that comes full circle is the second religiousness. Just as the culture began in this deep piety, so too the intellect begins to exterminate itself. The culture renounces by ceasing to manifest itself in great geniuses. You get fewer and fewer and fewer of them, and the individual renounces by laying aside books. People stop reading. I mean, you get the Neil Postmans and the McLuhans who cry and whine about electronic culture as signifying, getting rid of books, but that isn't the case from Spengler's point of view. That's simply the manifestation in our culture of what happened in the Roman civilization when people started burning books. They stopped reading. The Romans expelled philosophers left and right. They had huge book burnings. And as soon as you get autocratic authority coming in and can determine who can read what, I mean, the civilization is just no longer interested in thought and begins to shift over into belief, into spirituality. And so the Romans, in the time of Caesar, when the Republic was disintegrating, and if anybody's seen I, Claudius, you've got this in your mind, then they begin reverting to oracles, and they start thinking about astrology, and you get all this sudden proliferation of mystery cults all over the place, of which Christianity was merely one, and they're all competing. And Spengler says this is what we've got in store for us and over the next century, between 2100 and 2200, he says, I can make predictions in this book that will be more accurate than any historian has ever made before based on this model. And so far, the predictions that he's made for the 20th century have been dead on. And the predictions that he's made for 2100 to 2200 are the reversion to Caesarism, the disintegration of Republican electoral politics, the rise of force politics, and the gradual fascination with the occult and a return of deep, profound spirituality as this whole thing begins to sink back into Mother Earth. And then as far as Spengler is concerned, our technology is something that came out of the soul of our culture, and as we die, our technological systems will gradually die along with us. So this is not a permanent thing here, any more than the little Greek machines were to them. He says, our civilization will lie in ruins one day, just as the Roman roads lie in ruins, and the gigantic aqueducts that they had lie in ruins. So too, this is what we have to look forward to, as a gradual extermination of populations and this sort of gigantic series of ruins. It's centuries down the line, that point. But he says that's where we're headed. So with Spengler, we get this wonderful pessimism about where we're headed. One of the reasons people don't read Spengler is because it's so gloomy. But the other reason is because it's so difficult to read, because he talks about everything simultaneously. The paragraphs are so dense. And he's a generalist, and the academics immediately attacked him when his book came out, saying, well, at this point about Egyptian pottery fragments, you didn't get this right. And you know, the academics are always specialized, and they can't see the forest for the trees. You know, they're specializing on trees. But Spengler had this vision, and I think it's correct as far as it goes.